This is the beginning now of our fourth and final section on October 17. Now, having said that, before we go into chapter 6, let's just go back to verse 24. I said we'd come back here. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Theologians believe that, what does that mean? That God took him without seeing death. He went to heaven without seeing death. Now, that's very important, because later on, there's another prophet by the name of Elijah. Or was it Elisha?
Sure.
Elisha, who did not die, but God took him into heaven with a fiery chariot. Fiery chariot came down from heaven. Elisha got on, and the chariot went back into heaven. So I'm saying this for a reason, because of what Pastor Weber brought up before. There are two people that we know of for certain that went to heaven without dying physically. Enoch being one, and Elisha being the other. That sets us up now for church history. In addition to what the Roman Catholic Church teaches about Mary being the Immaculate Conception conceived without sin, they also believe that when Mary came to the end of her days, she was bodily assumed into heaven without seeing death, physical death. And they celebrate that on August 15th, called the Assumption. Now, we can't prove that, because if we go to the Orthodox, the Eastern side of Christianity, they believe that Mary first died and then she was assumed to heaven. But the Roman Church, if I'm reading it correctly, they believe that when Mary's days were fulfilled, she was bodily assumed into heaven. Now, I say that because I could accept that, Luther did, I could accept that more than the Immaculate Conception. Why? Because in the Bible there are at least two examples of how God took someone to heaven without first experiencing physical death.
Enoch and Elijah.
Yes. So if God wanted to show his favor to Mary for what she did, that could have been a way that God did it. Remember last week when we talked about Eve, we talked about how Paul talks about Jesus being the second Adam, who fulfilled what the first Adam could not, and then within that whole thing, how Mary becomes the new Eve by her obedience to her son, fulfills God's will because of her obedience. Okay, any questions just on that? I know it's a little highlight. Two people that did not see, as we believe, physical death before they went to heaven. So let's get into chapter 6. Oh, by the way, before we leave 5, all these people that lived 900 and some years old, we call these the descendants of Abraham, or the patriarchs. So sometimes if you're in some kind of a Bible study or in a sermon, the pastor just says about the patriarchs, this is kind of what we're talking about. Those are the patriarchs, the 12 generations between the fall of Adam and Eve into sin and then the coming of Noah. So those 12 generations in there are made up of the patriarchs. The patriarchs who are marrying, patriarchs who are having children, whose children are having children, etc., 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 to fill the earth and subdue it. Now chapter 6. See, the plan is working. Verse 1. When men began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that their daughters of men were fair, and they took to wife such of them as they chose. So that gives us an idea that as this multiplication is happening, men and daughters and sisters are coming together. Well, I want to jump for our purposes to verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. Look at verse 6, another anthropomorphism. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. God is showing us a human side of himself. Everything became so mixed up, so wicked, so confusing, that God looked out over what he had created, and he was sorry that he did it.
How must we feel today?
That's a very good question. How must he feel today? Well, let's put it within the New Testament context. How does he feel today when he sent an answer to our problem, and there are many people that turn their back? Did not I quote the passage last week, you have not because you ask not? How many people are going to hell? Unbeknownst to them, perhaps, but how many people are going to hell because they have not surrendered their life to Christ and said there's a better way? I'm going to trust God's way, not my way. My way is tainted. You know, I've got the reverse Midas touch. Everything I touch turns to coal. I've got to do it God's way. So yeah, I mean, it must grieve God's heart. But to a degree, people who act wicked, act sinful, apart from the blood of Christ covering their souls, they're going to wind up going to where, you know, that place that was created for the devil and all his evil angels. So I think this is about as far as we want to go. We're going to leave it there today. And next week when we come back, then we'll take a look at the flood. If you want to go ahead and read, the rest of 6, 7, 8, and 9 really talk about the flood. And that's some interesting things too, because ultimately, maybe I'll ask Pastor Weber to kind of chime in every now and then, because ultimately there are in other cultures, which is possible as people moved out, there are other different kinds of, quote, flood stories. So, you know, but we'll take a look at the Bible as the record. But before we close the book, any questions or any just comments on what we've talked about today? I thought we had some